betrayed by the very crown she once helped forge, Anne Boleyn faced her fate not with fear, but with unwavering dignity. From her swift rise to the throne, to the web of political intrigue, false charges, and a meticulously planned execution by sword, her story is one of both triumph and tragedy. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the sky above the Tower of London was a cold, somber gray, foreshadowing the grim fate that was about to unfold. In the inner courtyard stood a scaffold, unusual in its design, not raised as a typical platform but lower to the ground, prepared for a foreign executioner armed with a sharp sword rather than the customary English axe. As the crowd slowly gathered, whispers spread through the air. Today would mark history. A queen was about to die, the first in England's long history. Anne Boleyn, the woman whose ambition had irrevocably altered the kingdom and severed England's ties with Rome, was about to meet her end. For the past 17 days, Anne had been locked within the cold stone walls of the tower, but on this morning, the reality of her final moments set in. Yet she still carried the regal grace that had once captivated King Henry VIII. With quiet poise, her loyal ladies-in-waiting assisted her in dressing, and Anne made a deliberate choice, a dark gray mantle lined with fur over a crimson bodice. Practical yet dignified, she chose colors that would not show blood, aware of her fate but holding on to her composure. Despite the terror that surely loomed over her, Anne faced her execution with remarkable calm. "I hear the executioner is very good," she said, lightly touching her neck with a wry smile. "I have a little neck." The irony in her words, recorded by witnesses, showed both courage and dark humor in the face of death. In those final moments, Anne Boleyn confronted her fate not with fear, but with an unshakable grace, a final testament to the strength and dignity she carried to her last breath. Anne Boleyn, daughter of the ambitious diplomat Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard of noble descent, was raised in the sophisticated French court, where she absorbed the refined culture of the Renaissance, a cultural elegance that would come to define her. Upon her return to England in 1522, Anne wasn't regarded as a classical beauty by the standards of the time. With her olive skin, dark eyes, and black hair, she diverged from the era's ideal of pale skin and blonde hair. However, what Anne lacked in conventional beauty, she made up for with a brilliant intellect, fluency in languages, a deep appreciation for the arts, and an undeniable charisma that captured the attention of everyone she met. When King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, turned his attention to Anne, she refused to follow the path of her sister, Mary Boleyn, who had already been the king's mistress. "I will not be your concubine," she boldly declared. "If you want my heart and body, you must give me a crown." It was a daring challenge, but one that would set in motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of English history. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. For 7 years, from 1526 to 1533, Henry pursued Anne with an obsession that reshaped the kingdom. His relentless desire for her led to a break with the Catholic Church, the founding of the Church of England, and a complete overhaul of England's religious landscape. To marry Anne, Henry defied the Pope and Emperor Charles V, forever changing the political and religious fabric of the nation. Anne's courage to refuse to be just another mistress, and her unwavering demand for a crown, would shape not only England's future, but the very course of history itself. In January 1533, Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII secretly wed, with Anne already carrying their child. However, in September, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, far from the male heir Henry so desperately craved. Anne's reign as queen was brief, lasting only 3 years, yet her influence was profound. She was a visionary, intelligent, sharp, and an ardent advocate for religious reform. She championed the work of scholars and promoted the English translation of the Bible, a move that had once been forbidden. To her supporters, Anne was a reformer. To her detractors, she was a manipulative heretic. Anne's downfall began with her inability to provide a male heir. After Elizabeth, she suffered 2 heartbreaking miscarriages, one in 1534 and another in 1535, this time losing a male fetus. For Henry, whose obsession with securing a male successor had already strained their marriage, these failures were unforgivable. As Henry's love for Anne diminished, her enemies, particularly Thomas Cromwell, grew stronger. This created the perfect storm that would ultimately lead to Anne's tragic fall from grace. In April 1536, a plot to destroy Anne Boleyn began to take shape. Thomas Cromwell orchestrated an investigation into the Queen's alleged crimes, accusing her of shocking offenses. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges against her were outlandish. Accusations of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, as well as conspiracy to murder the king and treason. Her trial on May 15th was nothing short of a legal travesty. Anne had no right to counsel and was denied the opportunity to face her accusers. The tribunal, composed almost entirely of her political enemies, was thoroughly biased against her. Yet, Anne stood before them with remarkable poise, defending herself with eloquence and intelligence. One witness later noted that she answered every question so wisely that she appeared less a woman and more an angel. But the outcome was inevitable. The verdict had already been determined before the trial even began. Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning, the traditional punishment for female treason. However, in a final act of mercy, or perhaps to protect his own reputation, Henry VIII commuted her sentence to beheading. A skilled French executioner was brought in, promising Anne a swift and relatively painless death with the sword. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. But it wasn't until 8 a.m. that she received the shocking news. Her execution would be delayed until noon. The cruel delay was a bitter blow, for Anne had already steeled herself for the inevitable. Time seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and she spent those agonizing hours in prayer. Witnesses later recalled how she took communion, pausing frequently to murmur, "Lord, have mercy on me." In a final act of defiance, she swore on the sacred host that she had never betrayed King Henry VIII, declaring, "For my salvation I am free of the things for which I was condemned." At noon, the dreaded sound of drums echoed through the air. Anne bid her ladies-in-waiting a quiet farewell, giving each one a small token, prayer books, handkerchiefs, jewelry, as parting gifts. With a calm and steady voice, she asked, "Remember me and how I end?" before being led to the scaffold. The crowd gathered to witness her execution was smaller than expected, no more than 1,000 spectators. Yet, there was an unmistakable atmosphere of uneasy respect rather than celebration. As Anne appeared on the scaffold, dressed in her gray and crimson gown, the crowd fell silent. Most removed their hats in a silent tribute to the woman they once called Queen. Anne walked to the scaffold with the same dignity that had defined her life, composed and regal, until the very end. Once at the scaffold, Anne was allowed to speak, and she chose her words carefully. With unwavering grace, she addressed the crowd. "Good Christians, I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord." In those few words, Anne Boleyn displayed an extraordinary strength. She didn't beg for her life, nor did she try to justify herself or refute the charges. Instead, she presented herself as a loyal subject of the king, protecting his dignity even in the face of an unjust death. It was a brilliant political move, designed not only to preserve her own honor, but also to ensure her daughter Elizabeth would one day be viewed as the legitimate heir to the throne. After her speech, Anne calmly removed her mantle and cap, handing them to her ladies. In a final act of generosity, she gave the executioner a purse of gold coins, a payment for a job well done. Then she knelt on the scaffold, her fate closing in. But something was amiss. Unlike executions by axe, there was no block for Anne to rest her head on. The French custom of beheading with a sword required the condemned to remain upright, kneeling without support. Anne, ever composed, did not flinch. A final act of kindness came when one of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. With her head bowed, Anne whispered prayers, murmuring, "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The executioner, following tradition to ease her in her final moments, asked, "Where is my sword?" It was a brief distraction, a trick meant to mislead her before carrying out the brutal task. Anne turned her head slightly toward his voice, and in that fleeting moment the executioner struck with terrifying precision. The sword severed her neck in a single swift blow. A heavy silence followed. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only a quiet collective sigh from the crowd. The executioner held up Anne's severed head by the hair and raised it high for all to see, declaring, "So perish the king's enemies." But the crowd's reaction was not one of triumph or approval. A profound sense of discomfort lingered in the air, as though the execution had not been the victory of justice many had expected, but a tragic and somber moment of finality. At that very moment, the deafening sound of cannon fire rang out from the tower. It was the signal to Henry VIII, waiting in his Whitehall palace, that the way was now clear for him to marry again. The next day, Henry became formally engaged to Jane Seymour, and within 10 days, they were married. Anne's body was collected by her ladies-in-waiting, but in a final indignity, no proper coffin had been provided for the former queen. Instead, her body was placed in an empty arrow chest, with her head resting beside it. She was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, where her remains were hastily buried in an unmarked grave. No tombstone, no memorial, nothing to signify the resting place of a queen who had once shaped England's future. In an attempt to erase every trace of her memory, Henry VIII ordered that all portraits of Anne be destroyed, her emblem removed from royal palaces, and her name struck from official records. This damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was so thorough that no authenticated contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn survives to this day. Yet, despite Henry's relentless efforts to obliterate her legacy, Anne's influence endured. Even in death, she left an indelible mark on the course of English history and on the future of her daughter Elizabeth, who would rise to become one of the most powerful and revered monarchs in history, Queen Elizabeth I. 23 years after Anne Boleyn's tragic execution, her daughter Elizabeth rose to the throne of England. Elizabeth I's reign, which would span an incredible 45 years, would come to be known as a golden age in English history. In nearly every respect, Elizabeth surpassed her father, Henry VIII, achieving the stability he had desperately sought throughout his life. But that stability came not from his own bloodline, but from the daughter he had once dismissed as a disappointment. In 1876, during renovations at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne was believed to be buried, workers unearthed a female skeleton. The delicate bone structure and small skull suggested that the remains likely belonged to Anne herself. In an act of solemn respect, her remains were reburied, this time with the dignity befitting her status as a former queen. Today, a simple glass slab marks the spot where Anne met her end on the lawn of the Tower of London. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, roses are placed there by admirers, a quiet tribute to a woman whose story continues to resonate. For many, Anne Boleyn represents more than just a tragic figure. She symbolizes the historical injustice faced by powerful women throughout history. The ultimate irony, however, lies in the reign of her daughter. Elizabeth, once seen as a failure by her father, carefully crafted her rule by embracing the qualities of the mother who had been condemned. She adopted the white falcon emblem of the Boleyns, and learning from Anne's fate declared herself the Virgin Queen, married only to England. Elizabeth's remarkable reign was built on the ashes of Anne's sacrifice, a sacrifice that began on that fateful gray morning in 1536, when Anne Boleyn walked to her death with unshakable grace and dignity, unknowingly paving the way for her daughter to one day reign supreme.